Why would thousands of individuals purchase official admission tickets to gather in the central square of a Czechoslovak town in 1946? They congregated in the freezing air where the synchronized sound of thousands of people breathing permeated the silence, solely to witness the public hanging of a 23-year-old woman. This execution did not unfold as a sudden burst of emotional vengeance, but rather served as the final, meticulously calculated act of the new government eradicating a collaborationist element from its society. In order to legitimize post-war justice and formalize the retribution process, local authorities systematically sold official tickets to the execution of state traitors. The individual standing upon the newly erected scaffold was Herta Kašparová. Her trajectory toward this state-sanctioned extermination accelerated rapidly during a single afternoon in May 1945. Within a confined local courtyard, the simple extension of one woman's index finger cost 11 men their lives in a single day. She physically pointed out her targets to the occupation forces, subsequently observing as firing squads systematically executed the identified citizens. The subsequent governmental investigation revealed a chilling foundation for this massacre. She did not facilitate the elimination of these specific individuals due to their political affiliations or resistance activities. Instead, she condemned them to death based entirely on personal resentment, utilizing the geopolitical machinery of terror to settle an intimate grievance against men who had simply rejected her affections. How does a future participant in the occupation police form? In the town of Třešť, this process began with a congenital foot defect. Long before the scaffold, strict demographics and a single surgical intervention determined Herta Kašparová's trajectory. She was born on June 21, 1923. Třešť held a population of roughly 5,000 people, forming a closed demographic system. In such a rigid environment, social mobility barely existed. Any physical deviation permanently fixed an individual's status without the option to change surroundings. After early corrective surgery, Herta's calf remained visibly undeveloped. A permanent limp marked her every step. This physical reality triggered an immediate social culling. The small town offered no alternative networks. Young men consistently bypassed her. The rejection was total. Escape was impossible. The contrast was stark. She possessed evident external attractiveness and bilingual fluency, yet she faced a complete physical impossibility to integrate into the society of her peers. By the time the war approached, her social isolation was absolute. How does a railway worker retain his position during an occupation? Alois Kasper simply altered his declaration of nationality and purchased a portrait of the new ruler. While her mother Františka maintained their household, Alois demonstrated a survival mechanism amidst shifting authorities in March 1939. Initially, this Brno Railway Administration employee pleaded to remain in his position by explicitly claiming a Czech identity. His administrative request was granted by the local management, but his professional mimicry evolved seamlessly once the geopolitical reality transformed. He secured his career trajectory by immediately joining the incoming ruling party. To display loyalty, he established a daily ritual of placing fresh flowers on his office desk directly beside the new leader's portrait. Herta silently absorbed this lesson. 30% of Czechoslovakia vanished with a single stroke of a pen. The leaders of Britain and France surrendered the borders to avoid a conflict. During September 29th and 30th, 1938, they signed the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovak representatives were completely excluded. Their nation was carved up in their absence. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew home with a signed document. He promised lasting peace. By the deal's terms, the country lost 30% of its territory and 70% of heavy industry. The international community legitimized the partition without consulting the local population. Then came the sudden shift. 6 months later, the early promises of diplomacy dissolved into military reality. On March 15, 1939, the full invasion began. The metallic clank of armored vehicle treads echoed loudly across Bohemian cobblestones. German forces tore up the previous agreement entirely. They marched straight into the capital. The occupation authorities immediately established the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. This macro-political collapse created a massive administrative vacuum across the entire region. A broken nation became the perfect environment for deep social transformations. Social outcasts like 18-year-old Herta gained an unexpected chance to rise. They stepped forward to fill the void. These individuals became crucial parts of the newly established security apparatus of the Reich. The local occupation infrastructure required massive and immediate civilian participation. Bureaucratic normalization of control relied heavily on ordinary clerks and typists. The new state apparatus created thousands of new vacancies in the Gestapo. How does an 18-year-old typist enter the state terror machine? Through an interpreter role during interrogations. The criminal police needed local staff. In February 1942, Jilava hired Herta. The station stood exactly 16 kilometers from Czech. Her brother Alois recommended her. She maintained the central card index. She recorded every local criminal offense. Both Czechs and Germans appeared across the police logs. On paper, it was safe. Just administrative paperwork. Files meant stability. Institutional reality ultimately offered very different practical contrasts. In September 1942, Zlín requested her transfer. The new location was southeastern Moravia. Her duties expanded rapidly under the occupational administration. She interpreted for Czech detainees. German investigators lacked language skills. Prisoners often refused to talk. Silence immediately provoked physical responses from the guards. Investigators reached for metal bullwhips. Thick wire struck human flesh. Calculated strikes specifically targeted vulnerable human body parts. The metallic sound echoed loudly. Men screamed inside the walls. The Gestapo relied on civilian clerks. Thousands typed official documents daily across the Protectorate. They enabled the entire police apparatus. Routine paperwork erased moral barriers. Herta translated desperate answers for official typed protocols. She watched grown men break. At first, officers sent her out. They shielded the young girl. She seemed completely unready for realities of torture. Then the protocol changed entirely. She stayed inside. She observed beatings. She never blinked. Her mother testified in tears during post-war proceedings. She described a gentle, obedient child. That girl loved local animals. She helped neighbors without asking for anything back. But that person completely vanished. She always returned. The previous self simply died out. Herta returned to the Zlín interrogation rooms, where administrative routine seamlessly transformed a regular citizen into a direct accomplice of the physical violence executed by the Reich. Where did $500 million of confiscated assets and the savings of 118,000 Jewish men, women, and children across Bohemia and Moravia disappear? They flowed directly into the accounts of the occupation administration. This expropriation commenced with anti-Jewish legislation and instantly frozen bank accounts. State robbery built a vast financial foundation, generating administrative jobs for people like Herta and securing loyalty from the ethnic German population. This wealth transfer constituted a huge portion of the pre-war gross domestic product, directly stabilizing the economy of the Reich. Stripped of all resources, centuries-old communities ceased to exist within a few months. 20 armed Czechs stormed the Kašparová family apartment. Loud banging echoed as they broke down the wooden doors. They seized jewelry, the confiscated savings. The men pointed weapons at the father and threatened the mother. On May 5, 1945, the monopoly on force held by the Reich collapsed. News of the Prague uprising triggered this sudden local vacuum. Over 30,000 insurgents had taken up arms against the occupation forces in the capital. Within hours, the shockwave reached Czech. 6 years of German rule ended in a single afternoon. Locals raised the Czechoslovak flag over the town hall. Spontaneous militias formed on the streets, taking control of key checkpoints. Militias seized weapons. Property confiscation began instantly. The entire German community was arrested. How do occupation forces regain control over a rebellious town? Through the execution of 13 people in the very first minutes after their arrival. On May 7, 1945, Wehrmacht and Gestapo units launched a retaliatory strike on the settlement of Trecht. These detachments traveled 16 kilometers from Jalava, deploying hundreds of armed soldiers to restore order. Immediate shooting of civilians without trial represented standard Wehrmacht anti-partisan doctrine across the eastern territories. The initial action left 13 bodies on the streets. Following this procedure, officers began gathering hostages from civilian homes. Soldiers pulled 60 Czech men from their residences and formed them into a long line. A German officer issued a direct order to identify the organizers of the local uprising. He turned to Herta Kašparová, placing her in a position of sudden authority. Herta walked slowly past the row of frightened hostages. She recognized the faces of her former neighbors and colleagues standing silently before her. Herta raised her extended hand, pointing her finger directly at the men who had previously raided her apartment. She identified 11 individuals in total. Soldiers escorted 10 of these selected captives straight into the courtyard of the local town hall. The dry sound of rifle shots echoed against the stone walls of the courtyard. The 11th man had already perished earlier alongside a separate group of prisoners, while the youngest victim of the entire massacre was only 17 years old. 33 dead citizens in a single day. 33 civilians died on May 7, 1945, because of a local grudge. The perpetrator then quietly disappeared into the kitchens of the Soviet army. The very troops that destroyed the Third Reich now ate meals prepared by her hands. Herta walked the line of captured men. She raised her hand. She pointed a finger. A single gesture dictated the fate of specific individuals. Post-war investigators uncovered a distinct pattern. These targets were not resistance fighters. They were simply men who had mocked her childhood disability. Some had loudly rejected her romantic advances. The youngest victim of this purge was 17. The collapsing borders of the Eastern Front provided a convenient cover for domestic revenge. Following the German retreat, she crossed the border to Gmunden, Austria. In 1945, the town held around 13,000 residents. Refugees easily vanished into the moving crowds. Investigators assumed the wanted collaborator was hiding in deep underground networks. In reality, she stood inside the local Soviet command. The heavy smell of army rations filled the kitchen air. She worked as a maid, constantly keeping her head down. She almost disappeared from history. Thousands of tickets were officially sold for a single hanging. A year separated the fugitive from state justice until September 13, 1946, when local citizens filled a České Budějovice courtyard. Authorities commercialized the retribution, printing paper passes that rustled in the hands of citizens, securing prime viewing spots. The regional center held roughly 38,000 residents, ensuring high turnout. The condemned woman stepped onto the platform before the gathered public. Herta was 23 years old when she faced a society demanding visible vengeance. The state turned this event into a regulated administrative procedure to process mass trauma. This hanging became one of the last public executions ever conducted in Czechoslovakia. How did authorities formalize this reprisal? Through the extraordinary People's Court protocols. She almost vanished. 9 months passed since the massacre. Then, February 1946 arrived. Someone recognized her face in Gmunden. Austrian police arrested her quickly. Authorities expedited her return to Czechoslovakia. Guards escorted her across the borders. Post-war tribunals processed cases very fast. Tens of thousands faced trial. The state needed rapid bureaucratic closure. Courts handled massive collaboration charges daily. The trial happened in Česka. 33 men died there earlier. Judges heard the formal evidence. Survivors spoke. Families testified. Neighbors confirmed the past events. Her thin defense fell apart. She claimed ignorance. She denied knowing the fatal consequences. Witnesses proved the exact opposite. She spent 3 years inside the occupation structures. She understood the occupation apparatus. She witnessed the daily violence. Verdict was death. Bureaucracy legalized it. Exactly 2 hours remained from the verdict to the gallows. She made one final request. The tribunal granted her exactly 1 hour to say goodbye to her brother Elos. What legacy did this trial leave behind? The rejection of public death by an entire state. The Herta Kašparová file closed an era of public reprisals across the territory. The extraordinary people's courts operated under the 1945 presidential decrees. Tens of thousands of citizens stood before these post-war tribunals. Civilians initially gathered in town squares to witness the swift verdicts firsthand. The state watched the crowds. Government officials recognized the mounting political cost of open hangings. Shortly after these events, the Czechoslovak parliament enacted new domestic legislation, permanently banning the practice of public executions across the nation. The legal boundaries shifted. Justice retreated behind doors. The trial documents stayed secured in the National Archives. These records detail a tragedy born of wartime occupation and civilian betrayal. Among the casualties was a boy of 17. The paper trail preserves exactly 33 documented names.